In the remote mountains of Montana Territory, where superstition ran as deep as the silver veins, lived a woman whose very name made hardened miners cross themselves and change direction when they saw her coming. The one-eyed midwife of Devil's Ridge was whispered about in saloons and feared in homesteads, her scarred face and mysterious past making her the subject of dark legends that grew with each telling. But when death came calling and no other help could be found, even the bravest men discovered that fear had limits. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources, and sometimes the people society fears most are the ones with the greatest capacity for healing and compassion. This is the incredible true story of how a dying cowboy's desperate crawl to a feared woman's cabin revealed the difference between appearance and character, proving that true healing comes from the heart, not the face that delivers it. Ready for a story that will challenge everything you think you know about judging others? Hit that like button if you believe in looking beyond appearances. Subscribe and ring that notification bell, because tales like this prove that our greatest helpers often come disguised as our greatest fears. Drop a comment about a time when someone unexpected helped you. I read every single one. The year was 1879, and the mining camp of Devil's Ridge, Montana Territory, had grown accustomed to living with legends that were half truth and half nightmare. Among the most feared of these legends was the woman known only as Mama Delilah, the one-eyed midwife who lived in a cabin perched on the ridge's highest point, visible to all but visited by few. Delilah Morrison had arrived in Devil's Ridge 5 years earlier, a woman of perhaps 40 years, whose left eye socket bore the angry red scar of some terrible violence, while her right eye held the keen intelligence of someone who had seen humanity at its worst and somehow retained compassion. Her medical knowledge seemed to extend far beyond what any frontier woman should possess. The townspeople whispered that Delilah had made a deal with dark forces to gain her healing powers, pointing to her uncanny ability to save patients that other healers had given up for dead. Her success rate with difficult births and dangerous injuries was so high that it seemed supernatural to people who understood little about proper medical training and sterile procedures. Delilah's cabin sat at the end of a winding trail that most residents avoided, surrounded by herb gardens that bloomed impossibly well in the harsh mountain climate. Smoke rose constantly from her chimney as she prepared the tinctures, salves, and medicines that had saved more lives in Devil's Ridge than anyone cared to acknowledge or admit. The midwife's appearance reinforced the fears that surrounded her reputation, as her scarred face and gruff manner made her seem more like a witch from children's stories than a healer. She wore dark clothing that emphasized her imposing presence, and her rare visits to town for supplies were conducted in grim silence that discouraged conversation or social interaction. What the townspeople didn't know was that Delilah had trained as a nurse in a Chicago hospital before personal tragedy drove her west to seek solitude and purpose in the frontier territories. Her medical knowledge came from years of formal education and practical experience, treating everything from gunshot wounds to cholera outbreaks in the city's poorest neighborhoods. The scar that marked Delilah's face was the result of her attempt to save a family from a tenement fire, an act of heroism that had cost her an eye, but saved 3 children's lives. The same courage that had driven her into that burning building now motivated her work in Devil's Ridge, though few people took the time to look past her appearance to understand her true character. Delilah's isolation suited her temperament after the betrayals and disappointments she had experienced in civilization, but it also allowed the local population to create their own explanations for her abilities rather than accepting the simpler truth that she was an exceptionally skilled medical practitioner working in a region that desperately needed her expertise. The herbs Delilah grew in her mountain garden were carefully selected for their medicinal properties, chosen according to knowledge gained through study of both traditional Native American remedies and modern pharmaceutical practices. Her cabin contained medical texts and surgical instruments that would have impressed doctors in Denver or San Francisco, though few people ever saw the inside of her sanctuary. The midwife's reputation for saving difficult births had spread throughout the territory, bringing desperate families from hundreds of miles away when local healers failed to help with complicated pregnancies. Her success in these cases came from proper medical training rather than supernatural intervention, though grateful families often attributed their good fortune to divine or magical assistance. Delilah's interactions with patients were brusque but effective, as she focused on medical needs rather than social niceties that seemed pointless given her patients' usual fear of her appearance. She saved lives without seeking gratitude or friendship, finding satisfaction in successful treatments rather than personal relationships that had caused her so much pain in the past. The local sheriff, Tom Bradley, was one of the few people who had glimpsed Delilah's true character during medical emergencies that required her assistance. He had seen her work tirelessly to save injured miners and shot outlaws with equal dedication, treating every patient according to their medical needs rather than their social standing or personal history. Dr. William Hayes, the territory's circuit physician who visited Devil's Ridge monthly, had privately expressed amazement at Delilah's medical skills and the cleanliness of her surgical procedures. He recognized her formal training and superior knowledge, but kept his professional respect private to avoid association with someone the community viewed with such suspicion and fear. The children of Devil's Ridge were particularly afraid of Delilah, having been warned by parents that the one-eyed woman would take them away if they misbehaved. These threats created a generation that grew up associating her with punishment and darkness, rather than the healing and life-saving work that actually defined her daily existence. The tragic irony of Delilah's situation was that the community that feared her most was also the one that benefited most from her presence, as her medical interventions had prevented countless deaths from infections, difficult births, and injuries that would have been fatal without proper treatment. Her skill had quietly shaped Devil's Ridge's survival and growth, though few people acknowledged or appreciated her contributions to their collective welfare. Buck Morrison, no relation to the midwife despite sharing her surname, had been riding the territory's cattle trails for 8 years when a simple horse accident became a life-threatening crisis that would test every assumption he had ever made about fear, pride, and the sources of human compassion. The 26-year-old cowboy had always prided himself on self-reliance and had never needed help from anyone, especially not from the feared woman whose reputation haunted Devil's Ridge. The accident occurred on a routine cattle drive when Buck's horse spooked at a rattlesnake and threw him against a rocky outcropping with force that shattered his left leg and opened a gash in his thigh that wouldn't stop bleeding. His fellow cowboys did what they could with basic trail medicine, but the bone had broken through the skin and infection was setting in despite their efforts to clean and bandage the wound. Buck's condition deteriorated rapidly over 3 days as fever consumed his strength, and the infected wound began showing signs of gangrene that would kill him if not treated properly. His trail companions faced the choice of attempting to transport him to the nearest town, a journey that would likely prove fatal in his condition, or seeking help from the only medical practitioner within reach. The other cowboys refused to approach Delilah's cabin despite Buck's worsening condition, as their fear of the one-eyed midwife outweighed their concern for their injured friend. They had heard too many dark stories about her methods and her appearance to risk personal contact, even when a man's life hung in the balance and she represented his only hope for survival. Buck's fever-induced delirium included vivid hallucinations, where he saw his dead mother pleading with him to swallow his pride and seek help from anyone who could save his life. The visions were so real that he could hear her voice telling him that appearances meant nothing when death was approaching, and that survival required accepting assistance regardless of its source. As his condition reached the critical point where death seemed imminent, Buck made the desperate decision to crawl to Delilah's cabin himself rather than die from pride and prejudice. His fellow cowboys watched in horror as he dragged himself from their camp, certain they were witnessing his final act of delirium rather than a rational plan for survival. The journey to Delilah's cabin was a nightmare of pain and determination that pushed Buck beyond every limit he thought he possessed. As he crawled uphill through brush and rocks while fighting to remain conscious despite blood loss and infection. Each yard forward required enormous effort, but the alternative was certain death in a camp where his friends were too frightened to seek proper help. Buck's progress was agonizingly slow as he stopped frequently to rest and fight off waves of nausea and dizziness that threatened to end his desperate journey before he reached his destination. The pain from his shattered leg was constant and overwhelming, but fear of dying young kept him moving forward, despite the physical agony that accompanied every movement. Darkness was falling when Buck finally reached Delilah's garden, his strength completely exhausted and his vision blurring from fever and blood loss. He collapsed among her herb plants, no longer able to crawl another inch, but hoping that his proximity to her cabin would somehow bring the help he needed to survive the night. The sound of Buck's collapse in her garden brought Delilah rushing from her cabin with a lantern, her medical instincts immediately assessing his condition, while her practical mind calculated what needed to be done to save a life that was clearly hanging by the thinnest thread. She had seen enough medical emergencies to recognize when someone was minutes away from death. Delilah's first priority was stopping Buck's bleeding and stabilizing his condition enough to move him inside where she could work properly, using emergency techniques learned during her hospital training to address the most immediate threats to his survival. Her movements were swift and efficient, driven by professional competence rather than personal feelings about the patient or his circumstances. The midwife's strength surprised Buck even in his semi-conscious state, as she managed to half-carry and half-drag him into her cabin despite his size and weight. Her determination to save his life overrode any physical limitations, and her experience with medical emergencies had taught her how to move patients safely, even when working alone. Buck's last clear memory before losing consciousness was seeing Delilah's scarred face leaning over him with intense concentration, her single eye focused on medical assessment rather than judgment or fear. Despite everything he had heard about her appearance and reputation, her expression showed nothing but professional concern for his survival and medical needs. The realization that he was completely dependent on the woman everyone feared most brought Buck a strange sense of peace, as if accepting help from Delilah represented the ultimate surrender of pride and prejudice in favor of basic human survival. His fevered mind understood that she was his only hope, and that was enough to justify everything he had been taught to fear about her. Delilah worked through the night to clean Buck's wounds, set his broken bone, and fight the infection that threatened to kill him despite her best efforts. Her medical skills were tested to their limits by the severity of his injuries, but her training and experience provided the knowledge necessary to give him a fighting chance at survival. Buck's recovery began slowly, as Delilah's medical expertise gradually overcame the infection and trauma that had brought him to death's threshold, though his healing process would require weeks of careful treatment and constant monitoring. The midwife's cabin became a hospital where sterile procedures and medicinal knowledge created an environment more advanced than anything available in most frontier towns. Delilah's bedside manner was gruff but effective, as she focused on medical necessities rather than emotional comfort while nursing Buck back to health. Her years of treating patients who feared her appearance had taught her to concentrate on results rather than personalities, though she found herself oddly affected by Buck's complete dependence on her skills and knowledge. The cowboy's gratitude was overwhelming once he regained enough consciousness to understand how close he had come to dying, and how much Delilah had risked by taking in a stranger whose injuries required constant attention. His fever broke on the third day, leaving him weak but clear-headed enough to appreciate the extent of her medical knowledge and the quality of care she was providing. Buck's presence in Delilah's cabin created an unusual situation for both of them, as she rarely had patients who stayed long enough to recover completely, while he had never been dependent on anyone for basic survival needs. Their forced intimacy broke down barriers that might have taken years to overcome under normal social circumstances, allowing genuine communication despite their vastly different backgrounds. Delilah's medical supplies impressed Buck with their quality and variety, as her cabin contained instruments and medicines that rivaled anything he had seen in established towns. Her knowledge of surgical procedures and pharmaceutical preparations became evident as she explained his treatment and the reasoning behind her medical decisions, revealing education that contradicted every assumption about her background. The midwife's story emerged gradually as Buck's recovery progressed, and their conversations moved beyond immediate medical concerns to personal histories that explained how they had both ended up in Devil's Ridge. Delilah shared selected details about her nursing training and the fire that had scarred her face, while Buck described his years working cattle drives across the Western Territories. Buck's respect for Delilah grew daily as he observed her dedication to his recovery and her obvious competence in handling medical challenges that would have overwhelmed less skilled practitioners. Her success in saving his leg from amputation demonstrated surgical skills that surpassed anything he had encountered during years of dangerous work that frequently resulted in serious injuries. The isolation of Delilah's cabin provided a sanctuary where Buck could heal without the judgment and social pressures that normally governed his interactions with others. While Delilah found herself enjoying the company of someone who appreciated her abilities rather than fearing her appearance, their mutual respect developed naturally as they spent weeks together focused on the practical goals of recovery and healing. Delilah's herb garden became a source of fascination for Buck as she explained the medicinal properties of various plants and how they could be prepared to treat different conditions. Her knowledge combined traditional frontier remedies with scientific understanding gained through formal medical training, creating an approach to healing that was both practical and sophisticated. The cowboy's strength returned gradually under Delilah's careful supervision as she designed exercises and activities that would restore his mobility without risking re-injury to his healing leg. Her understanding of anatomy and physical therapy reflected medical education that had prepared her for challenges far beyond simple frontier nursing, though she applied her knowledge without calling attention to its advanced nature. Buck's questions about Delilah's past revealed her reluctance to discuss the personal tragedies that had driven her to seek isolation in the mountains, though her professional pride in her medical achievements was evident when she described successful treatments and difficult cases. Her satisfaction came from saving lives rather than receiving recognition, an attitude that impressed Buck with its selfless dedication to healing. The midwife's reputation in Devil's Ridge became a source of anger for Buck, as he learned more about how the community treated someone whose skills had undoubtedly saved many of their lives. His growing friendship with Delilah made him understand how prejudice and fear had isolated someone whose contributions to their collective welfare were immeasurable but unacknowledged. Delilah's cabin contained medical texts and journals that revealed her commitment to staying current with advances in medical practice despite her isolation from professional communities. Buck's discovery of these materials reinforced his understanding that her expertise came from serious study and practical experience, rather than the supernatural sources imagined by superstitious townspeople. The trust that developed between Buck and Delilah transcended the normal boundaries between patient and healer, as their shared experience of recovery created a bond based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Buck's complete dependence on her skills had forced him to see past her appearance to appreciate her character, while Delilah's success in saving his life had restored her sense of purpose and professional satisfaction. As Buck's recovery neared completion, both he and Delilah faced the reality that his return to normal life would end their unusual friendship and return them to their previous isolation from meaningful human connection. The prospect of separation saddened both of them, as they had discovered in each other the understanding and acceptance that had been missing from their solitary lives in the harsh mountain territory. Buck's full recovery took 6 weeks under Delilah's expert care, and by the time he could walk without assistance, his perspective on life had been fundamentally transformed by experiencing genuine compassion from someone society had taught him to fear. His gratitude extended far beyond appreciation for medical treatment to recognition of the courage and selflessness that defined Delilah's character, despite her fearsome reputation. The Cowboy's return to Devil's Ridge created a sensation when he appeared healthy and whole after weeks of absence that most people assumed had ended in his death. His fellow cowboys were amazed to see him walking normally, and their questions about his recovery forced Buck to confront the community's prejudices about the woman who had saved his life through skilled medical intervention. Buck's public defense of Delilah challenged every assumption the townspeople had made about the one-eyed midwife, as he described her medical expertise, her dedication to healing, and the quality of care that had saved his leg from amputation and his life from certain death. His testimony carried weight because of his reputation for honesty and his obvious gratitude for treatment that had exceeded all expectations. The revelation that Delilah possessed formal medical training shocked the residents of Devil's Ridge, who had attributed her success to supernatural intervention rather than professional competence gained through years of study and practical experience. Buck's detailed accounts of her surgical skills and pharmaceutical knowledge forced them to reconsider their superstitious explanations for her healing abilities. Sheriff Tom Bradley publicly supported Buck's assessment of Delilah's character and medical skills, revealing his own observations of her work during emergencies that had required her assistance. His endorsement carried significant weight in the community, as people respected his judgment and appreciated his honesty about controversial subjects that others preferred to avoid discussing. The campaign to change community attitudes toward Delilah gained momentum as Buck organized visits from people who had benefited from her medical treatment over the years, encouraging them to share their stories publicly rather than maintaining the secrecy that had protected her reputation while denying her the recognition she deserved. Their testimonials painted a picture of dedicated service that contradicted the fearsome legends surrounding her work. Delilah's initial resistance to increase social contact reflected her protective instincts and past experiences with community rejection, but Buck's persistence and obvious sincere appreciation gradually convinced her to accept invitations to participate in town activities where her medical knowledge could benefit everyone. Her reluctant emergence from isolation marked the beginning of her integration into Devil's Ridge society. The midwife's first public appearance at a community gathering since her arrival 5 years earlier drew curious stares and nervous whispers. But Buck's presence as her escort and advocate helped smooth her social re-entry while demonstrating the genuine friendship that had developed between them during his recovery. Their partnership challenged social conventions while promoting understanding and acceptance. Delilah's medical consultations became more frequent and open as word spread about her willingness to treat patients in town, rather than requiring them to make the difficult journey to her mountain cabin. Her establishment of regular office hours in the sheriff's building provided convenient access to professional medical care that had previously been available only in emergencies or desperate circumstances. The transformation in community attitudes toward Delilah accelerated as more people experienced her competent, compassionate medical treatment firsthand rather than relying on second-hand stories and superstitious rumors. Her success in treating everything from childhood illnesses to serious injuries demonstrated the value of professional medical care and gradually overcame decades of prejudice based on appearance and reputation. Buck's decision to build a house near Delilah's cabin reflected both his desire to remain close to someone who had become his dearest friend and his recognition that she needed ongoing support in her efforts to overcome community prejudice. Their friendship had evolved into something approaching family relationship based on mutual respect, shared experiences, and genuine affection that transcended conventional social boundaries. The establishment of Devil's Ridge's first official medical clinic represented the culmination of Buck and Delilah's efforts to provide the community with professional health care while giving her the recognition and respect she deserved for years of dedicated service. Her appointment as the town's official physician validated her medical expertise while acknowledging the community's need for her skills. Delilah's marriage to Buck 2 years after his recovery surprised no one who had observed their growing partnership and mutual devotion. Though it challenged social conventions about appearance, age differences, and the relationships between patients and healers. Their wedding celebration brought together people whose lives had been touched by Delilah's medical expertise, creating a community gathering that honored both her professional achievements and personal happiness. The couple's first child, born healthy despite concerns about Delilah's age, represented triumph over the isolation and loneliness that had characterized both their lives before Buck's desperate crawl to her cabin brought them together. Their family became a symbol of hope and acceptance in a community that had learned to value character over appearance and competence over conformity. The legacy of Buck and Delilah's love story extended beyond their personal happiness to transform Devil's Ridge into a community that valued medical expertise and human compassion over superstition and fear. Their partnership demonstrated that genuine connection could overcome any barrier when based on mutual respect, shared values, and recognition of each other's true worth beneath surface appearances that initially inspired fear or prejudice.